South Pacific, August 1945. The sun burns white over the endless blue. The sea glows like molten glass, and the deck of the barge shimmers with heat. Sailors wipe sweat from their faces as the air tastes of salt and diesel. The war still rages across the islands, but here, a strange hum rises from a machine bolted to the deck. It isn't a gun. It isn't a radio. It's a compressor. Spinning. Groaning. Alive. Moments later, a cook lifts the lid of a metal cylinder. Inside, thick white ice cream churns slowly, cold and perfect, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Men cheer quietly. Some stare in disbelief. One leans closer, eyes wide, whispering, "Ice cream." Out here, it's the same dessert they ate as kids, but now it's more than that. It's proof that home still exists, that even 5,000 miles from America, someone thought about how to make life human again. The machine keeps turning, a small symbol of comfort in a world still burning. By 1943, the Pacific War had turned into an ocean-sized grind. The distances were unreal. From San Francisco to Manila was more than 7,000 miles. Between those points stretched a supply chain so complex it made ancient empires look primitive. Every bullet, every drop of fuel, every meal, all had to be shipped, stored, and moved again. And in that system, one problem kept showing up in reports from every front. Morale. The heat was relentless. The humidity rotted clothes, weapons, and tempers. Jungle rot, malaria, and boredom hit harder than enemy shells. Men on small islands lived in mud, slept beside insects, and ate the same canned rations for months. It wasn't just hunger. It was the slow corrosion of spirit. Commanders began noticing patterns. Units with steady supplies of decent food fought longer, stayed disciplined, and broke less often. The conclusion was clear. Food wasn't just fuel, it was control. By mid-1943, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps and Navy Bureau of Supplies had turned nutrition into strategy. Psychologists joined logisticians to study how food affected combat performance. One report stated plainly, "A soldier who eats well fights well." This thinking was new. Earlier wars treated food as an afterthought. World War II treated it as a weapon. The Pacific Theater was the ultimate test. Unlike Europe, there were no railroads, no nearby farms, no easy resupply. Everything came by ship, often across hostile waters. Refrigeration was scarce. Once ice melted, it was gone for good. To survive, the Americans built a moving city. Fleets of supply ships, refrigerated tankers, mobile workshops, and repair vessels. But even with this, keeping food cold in the tropics was a nightmare. And still, the military wanted something more than just food. They wanted comfort, something that reminded soldiers of home. That's where ice cream entered the story. By 1944, it had quietly become the most requested treat in military surveys. Soldiers wrote letters begging for it. Officers mentioned it in morale reports. One Marine wrote from Guadalcanal, "Sir, we'd trade a week's pay for a cold scoop." To anyone outside the military, the idea sounded absurd. Ice cream in a war zone? But to engineers and officers responsible for troop welfare, it made perfect sense. Ice cream wasn't luxury. It was psychology. It cooled the body, lifted mood, and evoked memory of summer days, baseball games, and the safety of home. It was edible morale. At the same time, the Japanese military faced the exact opposite reality. Their soldiers in the Pacific were starving. Rations ran out, ships were sunk, and logistics collapsed. Reports described troops boiling weeds for food. The contrast between the two armies grew starker with each month. So when American engineers began designing machines to freeze cream in tropical heat, it wasn't just invention, it was industrial warfare. The ability to deliver ice cream to men fighting on remote islands symbolized something larger, that America could make comfort mobile. that it could export civilization into chaos. By late 1944, this concept reached the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships. A proposal landed on a desk in Washington for the world's first floating ice cream factory. It would be built from a converted barge. It would have massive refrigeration units, powered mixers, and enough capacity to produce hundreds of gallons a day. The purpose was simple: serve ships and bases too far from supply depots. It sounded strange, but it was approved. And quickly, engineers began gathering materials. Pipes, condensers, ammonia compressors, and insulated tanks were loaded onto a flat-deck concrete barge. The plan was to send it straight into the war zone, a moving morale machine among the fleet. The Pacific was about to witness something no war had ever seen before: an industrial army making ice cream under fire. The machine was almost ready to sail. But to understand what it took to make that possible, you have to see what kind of war America was fighting behind the front line. A war of numbers, metal, and design. By early 1945, America's logistics network in the Pacific had evolved into something the world had never seen: an empire of efficiency stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. Every island base, every ship, every airfield connected through a chain of supply and coordination. Behind that structure were the engineers, the Seabees, the quartermasters, and the technicians who built an industrial civilization in places where even clean water was hard to find. They built ports out of coral, airstrips from jungle, and cities from nothing. To them, the ice cream project wasn't absurd. It was a technical challenge. If America could build floating dry docks and repair ships in combat zones, why not a floating dessert factory? The idea was born from two needs. First, the Navy's growing fleet required morale support far from base facilities. Second, refrigeration technology had advanced fast. Compressors, coils, and insulated holds could now handle Pacific temperatures. The plan combined both. The barge itself was built from concrete, 265 feet long, flat-decked, and non-self-propelled. It would be towed from island to island. Inside, engineers installed freezers, generators, and mixing drums. Its capacity? 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes. The machine was powered by diesel engines and cooled with ammonia-based systems, similar to those in industrial dairies back home. But everything was compacted, reinforced, and insulated to survive tropical humidity and naval transport. It was not just a morale project. It was logistics, turned into comfort. The barge could serve thousands of sailors daily. Destroyers and smaller vessels, which had no refrigeration, could pull alongside, load containers of ice cream, and deliver them to their crews. This wasn't an isolated case. Throughout the Pacific, smaller shipboard machines were being installed on carriers, repair ships, and even submarines. Ice cream became part of daily life for American sailors, a cold luxury that represented the reach of their nation. While Japanese troops rationed spoiled rice and fought on empty stomachs, U.S. sailors in the same region lined up for cones and bowls of vanilla. The psychological gap was enormous. Morale studies from the Bureau of Naval Personnel confirmed the impact. Sailors reported feeling connected to home when receiving small comforts. A single serving of ice cream could raise mood scores comparable to mail from family. It was scientifically measurable morale. War correspondents picked up the story later, calling it the sweetest front in history. But at the time, it remained largely unknown, a classified logistical detail buried inside supply reports. The U.S. High Command understood the symbolism. America wasn't just winning battles. It was proving that industrial power could create normalcy in chaos. While Japan's empire shrank, the United States projected abundance. The ice cream barge became a quiet message that, for the Americans, technology could make even the smallest human desire part of the war machine. Behind this effort stood a network of scientists, dairymen, and industrial suppliers back home. Companies like Borden, Carnation, and General Foods contributed materials and expertise. Military dairies in Hawaii and Australia produced mix bases, shipped frozen concentrate, and distributed them to forward units. It was supply chain warfare at its most precise. By mid-1945, the ice cream barge was operational. It was stationed near Ulithi Atoll, one of the largest naval anchorages of the war, serving ships preparing for the Okinawa invasion. Men who visited the barge described it as surreal. A floating factory surrounded by destroyers and carriers, pumping out gallons of dessert every hour while planes roared overhead. The success stunned even the engineers who built it. Reports came back noting minimal mechanical failure, consistent temperature control, and near uninterrupted production. But the barge was more than a novelty. It represented a principle that would define modern warfare. Control every variable, even morale. The Americans had turned comfort into strategy and made cold sweetness a weapon of endurance. Soon, ice cream would spread through the fleet, reaching foxholes, beaches, and carriers from the Solomons to Okinawa. And that's where the real story begins. Not in design rooms, but in how it changed the men who fought. Angle 1. The human side. Ice cream as a lifeline. For the men fighting in the Pacific, ice cream wasn't just a treat, it was a reminder of home. The climate was brutal, the air thick with humidity, the constant roar of engines, the sting of salt water, the smell of oil and death, all of it pressed on the human mind. When the war stretched into its third and fourth year, fatigue became an invisible enemy. Soldiers and sailors spoke of feeling detached, distant, hollow. Food had lost taste. Days blurred into each other. Then one day, someone handed them a bowl of vanilla ice cream. Cold, creamy, unmistakably American. For a few moments, the noise stopped. Memories flooded back. Birthdays, diners, backyard summers. It wasn't nostalgia for the past. It was proof that the world they were fighting for still existed. Letters from sailors described it vividly. One wrote, "It's the one thing that tastes like peace." Another joked that ice cream was the best ammo for homesickness. Morale wasn't an abstract military term. It was survival psychology. The Navy's own studies concluded that well-fed, emotionally stable men performed 20–30% better under stress. Ice cream wasn't wasted effort. It was efficiency disguised as comfort. Even commanders noticed the shift. When destroyer crews lined up for their daily ration, laughter returned. Quarrels stopped. The war still raged, but the men faced it with clearer minds. This wasn't luxury. It was human repair. One scoop at a time. Angle 2. The technological side. Engineering the impossible. Creating ice cream in tropical war zones required more than ingredients. It required precision engineering. Every step, from refrigeration to packaging, had to function flawlessly in conditions that broke ordinary machines. The ice cream barge was a masterpiece of wartime adaptation. Built on a reinforced concrete hull, it housed diesel generators that powered industrial compressors. These compressors used ammonia as the cooling medium, cycling through coils and insulated chambers to maintain near-freezing temperatures in 90-degree heat. The process was continuous. Liquid mix entered the churners, air was whipped in, and the frozen product was dispensed into metal containers, all under strict temperature control. Engineers had to prevent salt corrosion, power surges, and leaks. Everything had to be modular and repairable by crew with minimal training. Spare parts were limited, so components were overbuilt for durability. Even the packaging was redesigned. Paper cartons used in U.S. dairies failed in humidity. So the Navy switched to metal containers and sealed tins. Each barge carried its own desalination unit to produce fresh water for cleaning and cooling. Ice production was integrated into the same system, creating blocks for both preservation and drinks. When you think about it, the ice cream barge wasn't just a morale tool, it was a proof of concept for portable refrigeration. The same principles later powered field hospitals, vaccine storage, and mobile food units in future wars. It was innovation born from human need, and that made it revolutionary. Angle 3. The strategic side. Comfort as psychological warfare. The Pacific War wasn't only fought with bullets and bombs. It was a test of endurance, and America mastered that domain. Every small luxury, clean clothes, hot meals, mail delivery, and yes, ice cream, became a strategic advantage. The longer the troops stayed stable, the longer they could fight effectively. By 1945, Japanese forces were starving, dehydrated, and isolated. Reports from captured soldiers described morale collapse and hopelessness. Meanwhile, U.S. sailors anchored offshore with coffee, cigarettes, and ice cream. A contrast so sharp it defined the psychological gap between the two armies. Commanders understood that morale could win battles as surely as firepower. The ice cream barge might not have fired a shot, but it sustained the men who did. In modern terms, it was an early example of soft logistics, the integration of comfort and efficiency into combat systems. The Navy's morale operations were so advanced that psychologists later used them as models for Cold War readiness programs. Every time a destroyer replenished ice cream supplies from the barge, it symbolized something larger: America's ability to turn industrial might into human resilience. The Japanese war machine couldn't match that. It wasn't just outgunned, it was outlived. And the ice cream? It became the taste of victory long before the surrender was signed. Angle 4. The logistical side. Keeping the chain cold behind every scoop of ice cream was a web of logistics that stretched thousands of miles. The Pacific wasn't kind to supply lines. Ships faced typhoons, enemy submarines, and mechanical breakdowns. Yet the Navy kept its cold chain intact. The process started in California and Hawaii, where bulk dairy mix and dry ingredients were shipped in sealed drums. These reached forward bases like Ulithi, Guam, or Eniwetok, floating depots for the advancing fleet. There, the Navy's Service Squadron 10 took over. These squadrons were the invisible machinery of war. They refueled destroyers, repaired aircraft, and, unbelievably, resupplied ice cream. Refrigerated storeships carried the frozen product or raw mix, while ice cream barges anchored nearby acted as floating factories. Men loaded insulated containers by hand, often working under red lights to avoid enemy aircraft. The entire operation depended on precise timing. If one link broke, if power failed, if fuel ran low, if the mix spoiled, the system collapsed. But it rarely did. Engineers even devised backup systems powered by auxiliary engines or emergency hand cranks. Crew rotations were planned around production schedules. Everything functioned with military precision. For the U.S. Navy, this wasn't indulgence. It was proof of mastery. Japan's logistical network was collapsing under air raids, while America's supply lines stretched clean across oceans, still able to deliver frozen desserts. That contrast wasn't lost on observers. It was modern war distilled into one truth: whoever fed their men best, fought best. Angle 5. The cultural side. Identity in a cup for many troops. Ice cream became a symbol of who they were fighting for. It wasn't just food. It was American culture condensed into something simple and pure. Every nation had its field comforts. The British had tea. The Germans had sausage and beer. The Japanese had rice and green tea. The Americans? They had ice cream. Cold, sweet, perfectly unnecessary, and unmistakably theirs. It reflected everything about U.S. industrial and cultural confidence. Even at war, America could build pleasure into function. It could turn steel, fuel, and refrigeration into morale. It was efficiency wrapped in optimism. Newspapers back home celebrated these stories. One 1945 headline read, "Sailors get Sundays at sea." Families sent recipes, dairies offered advice, and companies like Borden and Carnation helped refine the mixes. Civilian industry was woven directly into wartime logistics. To American eyes, ice cream represented normal life. To Japanese observers, it looked impossible. Luxury in the middle of destruction. POW accounts after the war often mentioned this contrast. One Japanese officer wrote, "They fought with comfort. We fought with resolve. Their comfort endured longer." That single line captured the cultural difference. America fought with abundance, not arrogance, but confidence in its capacity to provide. Ice cream became an edible flag, floating in a tin cup. Angle 6, the emotional side. A small piece in a big war buy. The final months of the war, soldiers had seen too much. The jungles of Leyte, the blackened ruins of Manila, the endless sea of Okinawa. They had stripped men to the bone. Then came moments of calm. Between air raids and ship drills, sailors gathered under canvas awnings, each holding a small metal bowl. They laughed, traded stories, and pretended, just for a few minutes, that the world wasn't ending. Psychologists later found that small moments of normalcy during high-stress conditions could reduce combat fatigue by up to 40%. The Navy hadn't just built machines for food. It had built machines for memory. Many veterans recalled that moment years later, describing it not as luxury, but as salvation. One said, "It wasn't the sugar, it was the silence. You forgot the war for 5 minutes." These brief respites mattered. They reminded men what they were fighting for: a world that made sense, a taste that belonged to peace. And when the Pacific finally fell silent in August 1945, sailors aboard the USS Missouri toasted victory not with champagne, but with ice cream. It was fitting. The same dessert that carried them through war now marked its end. From here, the story shifts toward that final moment, when innovation, morale, and endurance met at the war's turning point. The summer of 1945 was suffocating in the Pacific. Temperatures soared past 100 degrees on steel decks that glowed white under the sun. The smell of diesel, sweat, and salt water filled the air. By then, the U.S. Navy's floating cities stretched across thousands of miles. Task Force 38 struck the Japanese mainland almost daily. Supply ships trailed close behind, ensuring the fleet never stopped moving, never ran dry, and never lost its rhythm. At the center of this logistical ballet stood one of the strangest vessels of the war, the ice cream barge. Designation 9514, a concrete-hulled, diesel-powered floating factory, built not to fight, but to sustain those who did. Anchored at Ulithi Atoll, it produced 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes, day and night. The barge supplied destroyers, cruisers, and landing craft heading toward Okinawa, the last and bloodiest island before Japan itself. As the invasion built momentum, every ship that passed Ulithi refueled, rearmed, and received its share of ice cream. Crews called it liquid morale. Commanders understood the math. 1 quart per man per day could mean sharper minds, steadier hands, and fewer breakdowns. While kamikazes crashed into ships at Okinawa, engineers worked below deck on Nayadert 514, adjusting compressors and sealing leaks. They wore oil-stained coveralls, their faces glowing in the pale blue light of refrigeration coils. They didn't carry rifles, but their work carried the spirit of the fleet. Each destroyer that pulled alongside came with empty containers. Within hours, they left filled with frozen cargo, vanilla, chocolate, or whatever flavor the mix allowed. The ice cream barge became an unofficial checkpoint of hope between terror and exhaustion. Reports from the time described sailors cheering when the supply boats arrived. Even hardened combat veterans paused to savor what they hadn't tasted in months. "We were burning through hell," one wrote, "and the Navy sent us ice cream." Meanwhile, on Okinawa, the ground forces faced nightmare conditions. Torrential rain turned the battlefield into mud and rot. The smell of decay hung thick. Rations were often cold, hard, tasteless. Word spread fast through the lines. The Navy was sending ice cream from offshore. Men didn't believe it at first. But soon, small mobile units arrived with frozen tins packed in dry ice. It was more than food. It was connection. A reminder that someone, somewhere, cared enough to think beyond survival. The Japanese soldiers noticed it too. Reports captured from diaries spoke with disbelief. One officer wrote, "The Americans fight as if they are at home. Even in war, they eat like kings." That psychological edge was devastating. While Japan's troops starved, America's could smile. The contrast spoke louder than propaganda. It told every man on both sides who controlled the future. Behind the scenes, Admiral Nimitz's logistics command, nicknamed the Silent Service, orchestrated it all. They treated food as seriously as ammunition. Their message was clear: a fed man fights longer. A happy man fights better. The ice cream barge became a symbol of that mindset. Its success triggered more refrigeration projects, including portable chillers for field hospitals and floating bakeries for bread. Every comfort that could fit on a hull was tested. By the time Okinawa ended in June 1945, more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers were dead, and the U.S. Navy had suffered its heaviest losses of the war. But morale among surviving crews remained unbroken. Letters home were filled with exhaustion and gratitude. "We're tired, but we're still human," one sailor wrote. They made sure of that. When Tokyo began burning under B-29 raids and whispers of the atomic bomb grew louder, the men on the front lines didn't know how the war would end. But they knew they could endure, because endurance, they'd learned, wasn't built from steel or strategy. It was built from care, even in something as small as a scoop of ice cream. As Japan's empire collapsed, the U.S. logistical machine reached its peak. Its final act wasn't destruction. It was preservation, of sanity, of humanity, of everything worth saving. And on a quiet night in July 1945, as IAC 514 churned away under a starlit sky, its crew listened to the distant thunder of carrier planes heading for Japan. Each gallon of ice cream they made was a promise that the war's end was near, and that America would arrive there still whole. August 1945. The Pacific was trembling on the edge of silence. Japan's cities burned, the Emperor's voice soon to echo through the radio waves. Yet aboard the U.S. fleet, life moved with mechanical precision. Drills, refueling, reports, and, still, the steady rhythm of the ice cream machines. The barge WWII 514 now operated near Okinawa, serving the enormous armada gathering for what would have been the invasion of Japan. Operation Downfall. Every ship that anchored nearby carried men who knew what that invasion meant. 1 million casualties, maybe more. Everyone felt the weight. Everyone understood that the end was close, but the cost could still be unimaginable. On deck, engineers checked compressors for the 1,000th time. Generators rumbled. The air was thick with humidity. But below deck, the cold chambers glowed faintly, filled with metal tins labeled Vanilla Mix. Each batch carried the same stenciled mark: Navy Supply Depot, Ulithi. As news filtered through, Hiroshima, then Nagasaki, the barge's crew kept working. No one celebrated yet. Not until the message arrived. Japan has accepted surrender terms. When it came, silence fell first. Men stared at each other, not quite believing. Then, from the nearby destroyers, cheers erupted. Flares shot into the sky. Gunfire turned into fireworks. Ships lit their signal lamps across the dark water, blinking messages of relief and disbelief. Aboard 9514, the men didn't fire guns. They fired up the churners. Within hours, the barge was producing at full capacity, 10 gallons every 7 minutes. But this time, it wasn't for rationing. It was for celebration. Sailors rowed over from nearby ships, shouting, laughing, begging for a cup. For the first time in years, no one was fighting, no one was hiding from aircraft alarms, and no one cared about quotas. The Pacific had turned from battlefield to banquet. One destroyer commander recorded in his log, "Victory declared." Received 20 gallons of ice cream from IX 514. Crew morale, highest since Pearl Harbor. The war that began with explosions ended with refrigeration hums. The sound of a diesel compressor running through the night became the anthem of peace, an unlikely monument to American ingenuity and endurance. Even in Tokyo Bay, aboard the USS Missouri during the surrender ceremony, sailors reported eating ice cream that morning. It was quiet comfort for a world waking from chaos. The contrast was staggering. Japan signing defeat papers under Allied banners, while a few decks below, young men scooped cold desserts into tin bowls. That image captured the entire arc of the Pacific War. America's industrial power didn't just destroy, it provided, repaired, and sustained. The same logistical genius that moved bombs and fuel across oceans could also deliver milk and sugar. The ice cream barge became more than an oddity in Navy records. It was a symbol of how far logistics had come, from the crude supply lines of 1942 to a seamless system that could feed millions across an ocean. When the fleet sailed into Tokyo Bay, its hulls scarred but engines strong. Its sailors carried stories of terror and endurance. Yet what many remembered most vividly was the small luxury that never failed them. Years later, veterans would gather at reunions and talk about Okinawa, about kamikazes, about long nights in the engine rooms, and someone would always bring up the ice cream. The laughter that followed wasn't about sweetness. It was about survival. In the Navy's post-war reports, 9-514 was mentioned only briefly. Mobile refrigeration and dairy production vessel, functioned efficiently in tropical conditions, just one line in thousands of pages. But that one line represented something vast. The proof that a nation fighting a global war never forgot what made its men human. As Japan lay in ruins, America stood unmatched, not only because of its weapons, but because of its will to care, even in the smallest details. That night, the barge's diesel engines slowed for the first time in months. The Pacific was quiet. Somewhere across the black horizon, cities still smoked, but aboard Night 514, the crew passed around one last round of ice cream. They didn't toast victory. They toasted life. And as the waves lapped against the concrete hull, the machine kept turning, the last hum of war fading into the soft rhythm of peace. From that moment, the story of the ice cream barge became legend. Proof that in war, even the smallest comfort could carry the greatest meaning. When peace settled over the Pacific, the floating fortresses of the U.S. Navy began to vanish. Ships sailed home. Bases closed. Men counted the days until they could see their families again. But the ice cream barge, 9514, stayed behind a little longer. It had no guns to clean, no medals to earn. Its purpose wasn't destruction, but restoration. For weeks after Japan's surrender, it continued to serve the fleet as part of the post-war occupation force. Sailors still lined up for bowls of ice cream, but this time, the taste meant something new. Peace. The U.S. military quickly realized how much this strange invention had mattered. Psychologists and logistics officers compiled reports on troop morale. They found that small morale innovations, like ice cream, fresh bread, and field showers, had cut combat fatigue by measurable margins. They kept men stable, alert, and disciplined. The Navy's Bureau of Medicine estimated that morale programs had reduced psychiatric casualties by nearly 15% compared to early war rates. Engineers who had once been assigned to bomb factories were now studying refrigeration systems, hospital chillers, and preservation units inspired by wartime designs. What had begun as a morale experiment had become a model for modern logistics. In 1946, the Navy formally retired 9514. Its machinery was stripped and studied, its hull left moored for a time at Guam before being scrapped. Yet its legacy lived quietly in blueprints and training manuals. Portable refrigeration units appeared in hospitals, research ships, and Arctic expeditions. Even NASA's early food preservation systems drew on lessons first tested in the Pacific's heat. Back home, the story spread through newspapers. Americans loved it. The war that had produced atomic bombs had also produced floating ice cream factories. It showed the world what made the United States different: an ability to merge industry with compassion. To veterans, the symbolism ran even deeper. Many who fought in the Pacific remembered the barge not as a curiosity but as a lifeline. In interviews decades later, they recalled its sound: the low mechanical hum in the dark, the glow of lights on the water. It reminded them that even in war, someone had cared enough to send them comfort. For them, it wasn't just about ice cream. It was proof of what victory meant: not revenge, not pride, but survival with humanity intact. In Tokyo, Japanese officers who witnessed the occupation were stunned by the efficiency of American supply systems. They wrote reports detailing the precision, the abundance, and the constant flow of resources. To them, it was clear why the United States had won. One officer described it as a nation that feeds its soldiers like children, and therefore fights like giants. The psychological divide was undeniable. Japan's men had fought bravely, but under hunger and exhaustion. America's fought fed, rested, and connected to home. That lesson reshaped post-war strategy across the world. The idea that morale could be engineered, that comfort was a weapon, became a permanent doctrine in U.S. military planning. From this philosophy came the next generation of innovations: mobile mess units, portable ovens, water purifiers, and eventually, self-contained food pods used in Korea and Vietnam. Every one of them carried a piece of IX-514's legacy. The war had ended, but the concept of sustaining through care had just begun. From here, the narrative follows how the memory of IX-514 transformed American military culture and became a lasting symbol of human-centered warfare. As the years passed, the ice cream barge faded into obscurity. It wasn't mentioned in history books. It didn't appear in war museums, but among those who served in the Pacific, its memory never disappeared. In veterans' reunions from San Diego to Norfolk, old sailors laughed about it like an inside joke. "We had our own dairy at sea," one would say, and others would nod, remembering the taste of cold vanilla in the middle of hell. For them, IT-514 was more than a floating machine. It was proof that someone back home had thought about their sanity, not just their survival. Military historians later pieced the story together from scattered records. They discovered that the barge had produced over 250,000 gallons of ice cream during its service, enough to feed nearly every sailor in the Pacific Fleet multiple times. It wasn't the quantity that impressed them. It was the intent. No other navy in the world had attempted anything like it. The Germans had struggled to feed their U-boat crews. The Japanese ran out of rice before the war's end. But the Americans built an entire morale infrastructure across the Pacific. Ships that repaired other ships, barges that baked bread, and yes, one that made ice cream. It wasn't arrogance. It was strategy, a recognition that modern warfare was as much psychological as physical. After 1945, the lesson spread through American culture. Civilian industries began adopting the same mobile technologies the Navy had perfected. Refrigerated trucks, modular kitchens, and field cold storage became standard in construction, exploration, and even disaster relief. The line between military logistics and everyday life blurred. By the 1950s, almost every American neighborhood had an ice cream truck, a peacetime echo of the Navy's wartime morale machines. The same technology that once crossed oceans now rolled through suburbs, carrying joy instead of rations. Engineers who had served on WWII, ATII 5 and 14, moved into civilian refrigeration companies. Some helped design early vending machines, portable freezers, and air conditioning systems. They had learned in the Pacific that comfort could be engineered, and that comfort could shape morale, performance, and even identity. Meanwhile, Japan's reconstruction took a different form. American occupation forces introduced industrial refrigeration and food preservation technologies as part of rebuilding efforts. Ironically, the same innovation that had symbolized American strength during the war became part of Japan's recovery after it. In time, the two nations that had fought to the brink of annihilation shared something small but powerful: the taste of ice cream in peace. By the 1980s, the story of the ice cream barge resurfaced in naval journals and documentaries. Younger audiences found it almost unbelievable. But for veterans, it made perfect sense. The war had shown that victory was built not only on firepower, but on humanity maintained under fire. A retired Navy officer summed it up best in an interview. "We fought a war with steel and courage, but we endured it with sugar and milk." That line captured the heart of what IT 514 stood for. It wasn't about dessert. It was about design. The deliberate choice to keep men human in a machine war. The ice cream barge never fired a shot, never took a life, and never made a headline. Yet its legacy outlived many ships that did. When the last of its crew passed, their families placed small tins of vanilla ice cream at their memorials. A quiet tribute to the vessel that gave comfort when the world was collapsing. From then on, in every Navy mess hall, ice cream remained a tradition, not for luxury, but remembrance. A reminder that even in total war, kindness could be engineered, and that care could be as strategic as combat. And that brings the story to its quiet conclusion. When machines stopped, men went home, and a humble invention became part of history's most human victory. In the end, the ice cream barge was never just a story about dessert. It was a story about what happens when a nation fights without losing its soul. War strips people down to instinct. It removes comfort, erases warmth, and pushes men to their limits. Yet somehow, in the middle of that chaos, America built a machine to make ice cream. That choice said everything about how it fought. Not only to win, but to remain human while doing it. Every sailor who lined up with a metal cup at Ulithi or Okinawa carried more than a ration. He carried proof that his country believed his spirit mattered as much as his strength. That was the true weapon. The belief that care was part of command. The Japanese soldiers who watched from across the lines couldn't understand it. To them, war meant endurance through suffering. To the Americans, it meant endurance through preservation. Of energy, of morale, of self. The outcome reflected those philosophies. IT 514 symbolized something deeper than logistics. It showed that technology could serve compassion, that innovation could sustain humanity, and that victory built on empathy would always outlast one built on fear. When you picture the end of World War II, you think of mushroom clouds, parades, and surrender papers. But somewhere out on a quiet sea, a concrete-hulled barge kept turning its engines, producing gallons of frozen hope. That's what victory really looked like. Calm, patient, and unmistakably human. The ice cream barge never made history for its size or firepower. It made history for its purpose. It proved that even amid destruction, civilization could endure. Not through conquest, but through care. And maybe that's why, decades later, the story still resonates. Because behind the headlines and battles, it reminds us of a simple truth. The measure of strength is not how much we can destroy, but how much we choose to preserve. A scoop of ice cream in a steel bowl. A moment of peace in a sea of war. That was America's quiet victory. And the ice cream barge was its sweetest symbol. As the years passed, the ice cream barge faded into obscurity. It wasn't mentioned in history books. It didn't appear in war museums. But among those who served in the Pacific, its memory never disappeared. In veterans' reunions from San Diego to Norfolk, old sailors laughed about it like an inside joke. We had our own dairy at sea, one would say, and others would nod, remembering the taste of cold vanilla in the middle of hell. For them, IT 514 was more than a floating machine. It was proof that someone back home had thought about their sanity, not just their survival. Military historians later pieced the story together from scattered records. They discovered that the barge had produced over 250,000 gallons of ice cream during its service, enough to feed nearly every sailor in the Pacific Fleet multiple times. It wasn't the quantity that impressed them. It was the intent. No other navy in the world had attempted anything like it. The Germans had struggled to feed their U-boat crews. The Japanese ran out of rice before the war's end. But the Americans built an entire morale infrastructure across the Pacific. Ships that repaired other ships, barges that baked bread, and yes, one that made ice cream. It wasn't arrogance. It was strategy, a recognition that modern warfare was as much psychological as physical. After 1945, the lesson spread through American culture. Civilian industries began adopting the same mobile technologies the Navy had perfected. Refrigerated trucks, modular kitchens, and field cold storage became standard in construction, exploration, and even disaster relief. The line between military logistics and everyday life blurred. By the 1950s, almost every American neighborhood had an ice cream truck, a peacetime echo of the Navy's wartime morale machines. The same technology that once crossed oceans now rolled through suburbs, carrying joy instead of rations. Engineers who had served on IX 5 and 14 moved into civilian refrigeration companies. Some helped design early vending machines, portable freezers, and air conditioning systems. They had learned in the Pacific that comfort could be engineered, and that comfort could shape morale, performance, and even identity. Meanwhile, Japan's reconstruction took a different form. American occupation forces introduced industrial refrigeration and food preservation technologies as part of rebuilding efforts. Ironically, the same innovation that had symbolized American strength during the war became part of Japan's recovery after it. In time, the two nations that had fought to the brink of annihilation shared something small but powerful: the taste of ice cream in peace. By the 1980s, the story of the ice cream barge resurfaced in naval journals and documentaries. Younger audiences found it almost unbelievable. But for veterans, it made perfect sense. The war had shown that victory was built not only on firepower, but on humanity maintained under fire. A retired Navy officer summed it up best in an interview. "We fought a war with steel and courage, but we endured it with sugar and milk." That line captured the heart of what IT 514 stood for. It wasn't about dessert. It was about design. The deliberate choice to keep men human in a machine war. The ice cream barge never fired a shot, never took a life, and never made a headline. Yet its legacy outlived many ships that did. When the last of its crew passed, their families placed small tins of vanilla ice cream at their memorials, a quiet tribute to the vessel that gave comfort when the world was collapsing. From then on, in every Navy mess hall, ice cream remained a tradition, not for luxury, but remembrance. A reminder that even in total war, kindness could be engineered, and that care could be as strategic as combat. And that brings the story to its quiet conclusion. When machines stopped, men went home, and a humble invention became part of history's most human victory. In the end, the ice cream barge was never just a story about dessert. It was a story about what happens when a nation fights without losing its soul. War strips people down to instinct. It removes comfort, erases warmth, and pushes men to their limits. Yet somehow, in the middle of that chaos, America built a machine to make ice cream. That choice said everything about how it fought. Not only to win, but to remain human while doing it. Every sailor who lined up with a metal cup at Ulithi or Okinawa carried more than a ration. He carried proof that his country believed his spirit mattered as much as his strength. That was the true weapon. The belief that care was part of command. The Japanese soldiers who watched from across the lines couldn't understand it. To them, war meant endurance through suffering. To the Americans, it meant endurance through preservation. Of energy, of morale, of self. The outcome reflected those philosophies. WWII 514 symbolized something deeper than logistics. It showed that technology could serve compassion, that innovation could sustain humanity, and that victory built on empathy would always outlast one built on fear. When you picture the end of World War II, you think of mushroom clouds, parades, and surrender papers. But somewhere out on a quiet sea, a concrete-hulled barge kept turning its engines, producing gallons of frozen hope. That's what victory really looked like. Calm, patient, and unmistakably human. The ice cream barge never made history for its size or firepower. It made history for its purpose. It proved that even amid destruction, civilization could endure. Not through conquest, but through care. And maybe that's why, decades later, the story still resonates. Because behind the headlines and battles, it reminds us of a simple truth. The measure of strength is not how much we can destroy, but how much we choose to preserve. A scoop of ice cream in a steel bowl. A moment of peace in a sea of war. That was America's quiet victory. And the ice cream barge was its sweetest symbol.